From 2Keto LLC, it's Keto Woman Podcast with Daisy Brackenhall.
Hello, Keto Lovelies. I'm Daisy Brackenhall, and I've spent most of my life struggling with my weight and confidence, and have always had a difficult relationship with food. Even when I finally got to my target weight, after weight loss surgery and eating low carb, I couldn't maintain it and I was miserable. Keto has given me the freedom to fall in love with food again, without the constant gain, loss, guilt, virtue cycle of before. Health and happiness is where it's at now, running on fat. Welcome to the Keto Woman Podcast. Each week I'll be chatting to inspirational women, maybe even the odd man, to discover the secrets to their success so that I can share them with you. So what is keto? Keto is a way of eating that enables you to switch your body's main fuel source from sugar to fat. Who doesn't want to be a fat burner, right? But how do we achieve this? A great place to start is by keeping carbs to 20 grams or less per day. So things like leafy greens and above ground vegetables, plus some nuts and seeds, and the incidental carbs you find in things like dairy. Moderate protein scaled to your lean body mass, and then fat to satiety. Once you're in the swing of things, you can tweak it to suit you. Make your own personalised keto. I'll be asking my guest each week what their keto looks like to show you just how flexible and fabulous this way of eating can be. I'm not a doctor, and most of my guests won't be either, so we can't give you medical advice. It's always best to work with your own doctor because they know you and your medical history, and so have access to the bigger picture. This week's extraordinary woman is Amy Berger. Amy, MS CNS NTP, is a US Air Force veteran, certified nutrition specialist and nutritional therapy practitioner who specializes in using low carbohydrate nutrition to help people reclaim their vitality through eating delicious foods. She loves showing people that getting and staying well doesn't require starvation, deprivation, or living at the gym. Her motto is "Real people need real food." She blogs at www.chewitnutrition.com, where she writes about a wide range of health and nutrition-related topics, such as insulin, metabolism, weight loss, thyroid function, and more. She is the author of The Alzheimer's Antidote, using a low-carb, high-fat diet to fight Alzheimer's disease, memory loss, and cognitive decline. Amy's first episode was so popular, I just had to ask her to come back again. Today we explore some of the issues that women struggle with when it comes to weight loss on low carb and keto. Welcome back, Amy, to the Keto Women Podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me back.
Well, it's wonderful to have you here. Your first show was so popular, I had to get you back by popular demand.
That's great. I'm glad people liked it.
So I asked you a bit when we were chatting the other day, and I thought it would be a nice topic to cover because it's always at the forefront of most people's minds. I asked you what was the most common problem that people came to you with in your practice.
Right. So for me, I get all kinds of issues from people, but the most common is people that have already been doing a low carb or ketogenic diet for a while and they're not getting the results they want. And 9 times out of 10, that result is fat loss. They want to lose weight, lose fat, and they're not.
And so obviously there are going to be different solutions for different people, but what are the most common issues that you seem to see that crop up time and time again?
The biggest issue that I see is people overdoing fat and skimping on protein, and especially overdoing fat in the context of a carbohydrate intake that is higher than they realize. And sometimes it's carb creep, sometimes it's just, Quest bars and the net carb thing. Every time I hear someone say, the ketogenic diet, it's a high fat diet, it kind of makes me cringe because the truth is this is a low carb diet first and foremost. The most important thing about a ketogenic diet when your goal is losing body fat is a very, very low carbohydrate intake. The high fat intake, I get so many people saying, I have trouble hitting my fat macro, or how do I get more fat? My calculator says I should have X grams of fat, and I'm adding fat to my coffee, and I'm having fat bombs, and I still, and people don't understand that. First of all, I think macros are, that word is actually becoming like nails on a chalkboard to me these days. In the Atkins book, all of the books he wrote, there was no mention of macros. There was no mention of percentages. It was just keep your total carbs very, very low. And the thing is, if somebody is consuming even just slightly more carbs than they realize, it might be enough that in the context of consuming a very, very high amount of fat, that they are either not going to really be fat burning at all, or they're just eating so much dietary fat that their body has no need to tap into its own stored fat, which is what you need to have happen when you're looking to lose body fat. So, the more cream cheese and oil and butter and coconut oil you add to your food, the less of a reason your body has to turn to its fat stores for fuel. And I have to be clear here, because I'm not trying to scare people away from fat. This is still a high-fat diet by percentage, but people have to keep in mind that part of the percentage of fat is accounted for by your body fat stores contributing to your energy. It doesn't all come from the fat on your plate. So yes, this is a high-fat diet, but it's a high-fat diet in the context of a very, very low-carb intake, and that's probably the biggest mistake I see people make. Some people like to do net carbs, which works for many, many people, but for some people, they really need to focus on total carbs, that it doesn't work when they just subtract the fiber. And I tend to think net carbs works when you're talking about whole food, when you're talking about subtracting the fiber from spinach or from almonds or Brazil nuts, but not when you're talking about these low-carb bars and shakes and packaged things. And I'm not against those products. I think there's a time and a place, and they can make this diet more enjoyable and easier to stick to. But some people do get in trouble with those net carbs in those types of products. So I just think some people are more sensitive to the fillers and the sugar alcohols than other people.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking about this whole fat question when I knew I was going to be talking to you, and you see it so much, don't you? Someone puts a question up, why am I struggling to lose weight? And someone will come up with the answer, you're not eating enough fat. You need to add fat. You need to add fat. And I thought, and it's got to the point where it has got a bit crazy. And people are saying, upping fat. You're not eating enough fat. You've got to add fat to your drinks, and you've got to add more fat to your food, and you've got to keep adding fat. And by some miraculous way of adding more fat, you're going to lose weight. And it's gone to an extreme. But I was thinking, this has probably come from somewhere sensible in the first place. And I was thinking, yes, it probably has. And it's all about context. And I can see that statement being thrown at somebody who's come from a very, very low fat context, and they're really, really struggling to drop that. So they're still carrying on. They've started low carb, high fat way of eating, but they're still holding on to wanting to stay really low fat. So they are dropping their carbs right down, but they're still staying with everything really lean meats, really not adding fat to anything. And then saying to somebody with that context, you need to think about adding a bit more fat, works. Do you see what I mean? But it feels like it's just gone way, way too far to the other extreme, where it just gets a bit crazy.
It's gone too far. But so there's two different contexts in there. I think some people go a little crazy on the fat because they feel like they can, right? After a lifetime of restricting fat or watching calories, they finally feel like they're allowed to have butter and allowed to have cheese and cream cheese, and it's great. And I think that's fine, especially when somebody's brand new. When somebody's brand new to this, I don't want them really weighing or measuring anything. The only thing they should worry about is keeping carbs very, very low. Get your body transitioned over to fat burning rather than sugar burning, make the transition, get used to a low carb, higher fat way of eating, and then over time assess where you are. If you are losing weight and you feel great, then what you're doing is working. I mean, I think I said last time on the show that I support whatever works. And if somebody's eating 70% fat, 80% fat, and is getting the results they want, then that's fine. That's really all that matters. If somebody's not getting the results they want, then they have to say, okay, what am I doing that might be getting in the way? Maybe I'm having too much fat. And so there's really not a black and white answer. It depends on the person and what's going on. Because I hear it all across the spectrum. I was not doing well, and then I added more fat, and I felt better. But I mean, your point is a good one. This sort of comes from the South Beach diet, which was low carb and low fat. And that's kind of like a protein-sparing modified fast, which is a diet that's very, very high in protein and extremely low in both carbs and fat. And it's meant to be done only for a short time, like a week or two at a time, then you refeed. And it's really a quick and dirty fat loss tool. It's not a diet that someone's supposed to follow for the long term. So I do think cutting, and when I say, cutting back a little bit on fat, it's not going to be a low fat diet. It's still going to be a high fat diet. It's just that if you're, like, for example, if you're eating a steak that's fatty, you don't have to add blue cheese on top of it. You don't have to, if you have a fatty pork chop, you don't have to wrap it in bacon. You don't have to pour olive oil on it. You can if you want to, but if you're not losing weight, those are the kind of things that should be stopped first. Liquid calories, adding oil to beverages, don't drink your calories ever. Except maybe, a splash or two of cream in your coffee is fine, but to be drinking a 400-calorie cup of coffee, I just don't see the point when you're having a hard time losing body fat.
And that's the thing, isn't it? It's always looking at the context and at the results you want. And as you said before, if you're getting the results you want, then you don't need to change anything. But if you're not, then you need to look at it. And this is one of the areas that you might need to change. It might not be the area that you need to change. It might be something else. But I like that, just that slight distinction you made there when you said low carb, higher fat. I think that's actually a better way of saying it, isn't it, than low carb, high fat in a way, because it's higher than you're probably coming from.
Right.
But it's not necessarily you've got to hit a certain fat target.
Exactly. I don't even understand how any of these macro calculators exist, because the human body is not a calculator and it's not a computer, and it doesn't work to say if you eat exactly this much protein and fat and carbs, you will lose exactly this much weight in exactly this amount of time, and if you walk this much on a treadmill. If the human body did accounting that way and math that way, I wouldn't have a job. I mean, I wish it was that easy. I mean, I would lose 10 pounds tomorrow if that was the way it worked. And so I have very good friends that have designed macro calculators. I'm not saying they're useless. I just don't really understand like the physics or the math of how they guesstimate as to what somebody is supposed to eat. I still think if you use a macro calculator, it's probably still just a guideline and a ballpark.
Exactly. I think it's a good place to start, isn't it? For somebody who's coming and they just don't know how to change from the way they were eating last week to the way they need to be eating now. It's a great place to start. But when you see people posting, because they're 5 grams away from their protein target, or they're, 2 grams under their carbohydrate target, and they think they need to hit their carbohydrate target, and the same with the fat, and it gets a bit of, like you say, just a numbers game, and that's sort of playing in, and I can understand why people do it, because it plays into the whole calorie counting model that a lot of us have been doing for years as well. So I can see why people like to have some kind of calculator, some kind of black and white numbers, because in a way it makes it easier, but in a lot of ways it doesn't.
No, it makes it complicated and difficult, and it's unnecessary for most people.
You spoke a bit about the importance of keeping the carbs down and carb creep. And I mean, everyone knows everyone's heard about carb creep and how, it can crop up in places that you're not expecting, like, sauces or different ingredients. But then you said just about in general, just overdoing the carb sources a bit that people don't really think about. Perhaps you could talk just a bit more about what you meant by that. Is it eating too many vegetables, say, or are you talking about something else there?
It's actually everything. And I think it just depends on what somebody's eating. I think it is hard to overdo things like broccoli and zucchini, but it's possible. It's not impossible. It's just difficult. So I think the more fat you're eating, the more careful you need to be about all carbohydrate, including the fibrous vegetables and the mushrooms and the nuts and things like that, because they do add up. These things they're low carb, they're not carb free, they're not zero carb. Even heavy cream, I think, is about one gram per tablespoon or something. So it adds up. If you have 2 or 3 cups of coffee with 2 tablespoons a day, that could be like 5 or 6 grams right there. And if you have to stay under 20 total for the day, let's say like a true Atkins induction style diet, that's a fourth of your carb count just in heavy cream. Same thing with cheese. It's not carb free. It's just very low carb. So all of these things sort of have to be taken into account. But I think probably the majority of the overdoing the carbs is from little things like, I don't even know whether it would be fat bombs that have sweeteners that may have additives that have slightly, not a negligible amount, very low carb, but not negligible. And like I said, I keep using Quest bars. I love Quest bars. I don't mean to demonize them. I actually eat them every now and then, but I feel like some people will eat, 1 a day, 2 a day. That's not really, it's not supposed to be a meal replacement. It's not supposed to be a daily staple of your diet. Or even things like, just as an example, again, Epic bars. I love Epic bars. I like what the company stands for. Even I think they were just purchased by General Mills or some larger company. But, they make bars out of grass-fed meats and pastured pork and things like that. But you really have to read the labels because most of them have dried fruit in them.
Really?
And so the bar is mostly protein and fat, but it could have, anywhere from 2 to 10 grams of carbohydrate for this tiny, tiny, like 3-ounce bar, maybe not even, almost like a 1-ounce bar. So that it's something that you would grab and not think that it's high carb, but it has a lot more carbs than you realize. So it's hard, and I've done this myself, where I just get a little bit complacent, and I don't realize that over the course of the day, I've had a lot of low carb things, but they are not zero carb, and they do add up. So I don't think there's any one method. I think it just depends on what the individual person is doing, whether they're having like Atkins bars or, homemade chocolates that maybe have a little bit of something carby in them.
There's one of the common denominators, I think, is if anything that's more processed. I mean, things obviously like those bars are really quite processed, but just the things you make, some of the sort of more treaty type items that you'll make at home that are so highly palatable and are very easy to overeat and start racking up.
Yeah. And I think, this is only my hunch, my guess, but I think the reason that so many of us use those things is partly because of this fear of protein that's cropped up. Instead, because we're afraid to eat an extra piece of chicken or another serving of beef or pork, we'll reach for a fat bomb instead, or for some type of quote unquote keto bar, keto shake, keto product, whatever, when we would have been much better off having 2 more hard-boiled eggs or an extra strip of bacon or something like that. I think a lot of us, and like I said, I've done this myself, so I can speak from personal experience that this has happened to me. I too was thinking, it's quote unquote safer for me to eat more fat, so I'll have a spoonful of coconut oil instead of an egg, when I would have been better off with the egg.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk a bit about that, because I know that some people, they do fear protein, and you get terms thrown out like, it's just gonna turn to sugar, gluconeogenesis, or it's the same as eating cake. So is there any group of people that do have to do have to regulate their protein, because I know I have spoken to people who have type 2 diabetes or still have a good level of insulin resistance, who do find if they eat too much protein for them that it does cause problems.
Right. So yeah, there is something to that. There's really no black and white answers, and it's a shame, because I know that's what people want. Mm-hmm. They want to be told yes or no, this or that. It's not a binary system. It really does depend on the person. And I do think it seems to be that the people that are very, very insulin resistant, that have a very hard time losing weight no matter what they do, even on keto and low carb, they do seem to do better with slightly lower protein, not low, but lower and higher fat, at least at the beginning. And as they lean out over time, over months or possibly years, they may find that they do better shifting their diet gradually toward cutting back a little bit on the fat and increasing the protein as they become more metabolically healthy. I've heard that from a lot of people. And that's a really important point, because the human body is dynamic and changing, and what works for you at one point may not be the thing that's going to work for you 5 years later or 6 months later. And people, myself included, we get so afraid to change things when but this worked so well. But when you get to a point where it's not working, you have to ask yourself, okay, what I'm doing now isn't working. It got me to this point, but it doesn't seem to be getting me to where I want to go next. Then you have to just kind of have the courage to make a change, whether that's increasing protein or increasing fat or increasing carbs or decreasing carbs, change something in some way. But the protein thing, like I said, it does matter for some people. For a lot of people, it doesn't. And some of the fear of protein is because for some people, it will reduce your ketone level. If you're testing blood ketones, you might say, well, I ate this huge serving of chicken and it, quote, kicked me out of ketosis. And that phrase, just like macros, this is like the worst nails on a chalkboard for me. Being in ketosis, the state of and we talked about this in the last show we did together, having high ketones does not cause fat loss. So if protein does lower your ketone levels, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a problem or that it's going to stall your fat loss. It might be just the opposite. So the fact that the protein may reduce somebody's level of ketosis is a non-concern for me. Different context, right? If we're talking about a cancer patient or talking about someone with epilepsy or Parkinson's, that's a different scenario. If we're talking about someone who's going for fat loss, the ketones matter a lot less to me.
I was listening to Carl Franklin was talking about this the other day, and I liked the logic, and I wonder what you think about it. We speak about when you're wanting to lose fat, that part of the fat that you consume comes from your own body. And that's part of, what enables fat loss. And he was talking about, and he used this in the context of fasting in particular, and also keeping his protein down at a moderate or lower level, was that he has a lot of junky proteins that he wants to use up. And he spoke about it in that same context, that if you reduce the level you eat, perhaps your body pulls from those junky proteins and so tops up your protein level that way. I quite like the logic of that. I don't know what you think about it, but that sort of seemed logical.
You'll hear Jason Fung say a lot of the same things. Like when you fast, that's your body's opportunity to sort of break down and recycle some of these old, worn out proteins. And there's so many illnesses that are, at least, I hate this phrase too, associated with the buildup of abnormal proteins. Alzheimer's is one of them. Parkinson's is one of them. Cancer may be one of these misfolded, malfunctioning proteins. To be honest, I don't know how that works. I haven't looked at the research enough to know about that. It sounds good. It sounds logical, but whether or not that actually happens, I don't know. I tend to trust Jason Fung when he says that. He's been doing this a long time and he's helped thousands of patients. So I have no reason to doubt what he claims, but I don't know for sure. And I again, there may be a time and a place, like I guess you were talking about Carl. Carl still has, a fair bit of weight that he's probably trying to lose. I see a lot of women who are already somewhat slender, that are already quite weight reduced, that are trying to fast or significantly cut back on protein. They're afraid of mTOR and they're afraid of cancer and all this stuff. And I see it working really poorly for them when they skimp on protein.
Yes, I do think there's that contest, and it does make sense to me. Using and Jason Fung does talk about that with his obese patients that lose weight, he sees less problems with excess skin along the way. So right. I do like the logic of your body using its own protein the way it uses its own fat. But like you say, it's not something that you can prove or disprove, is it? Other than, I just suppose, again, from people's results.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have enough experience, fasting people for the long term. Little intermittent fasting is different, 16/8 or even 24 hours once a week or a couple times a week. I think that's very different from the long-term fasting that probably induces more of those changes.
Exactly. Yes, there's a debate, isn't there, as to when that really starts kicking in. What other things are there that women in particular can look for if they're struggling to lose weight? What else might be holding them up?
I think stress is a biggie. Women are under a lot more stress than they acknowledge because we've come to think it's normal. It's normal to only get 5 or 6 hours of sleep. It's normal to, from the second you wake up, you're taking care of the kids and you're getting dressed and you're rushing off to work and you're taking care of all the stuff at work, and you come home and you pick up the kids and you drive them to their activities and you make dinner and the husband and you got the laundry, and that's become normal. So people don't realize how exhausted they are and how fatigued and how their body is in crisis mode constantly. When your body is in crisis mode, and you're forcing yourself to go from one thing to the next with no breaks, I think getting rid of excess fat is the body's last priority. That's not really not number one on the list to take care of you and keep you going.
Exactly. So it's always the automatic focus, isn't it, to think it's diet that's the problem, but it could be other things.
Well, I do think, to be fair, I think the diet is usually the most common factor. Right. It's the carb creep, it's the excess fat. But when someone has that dialed in and the fat loss isn't happening or other results aren't happening, because I think when you do have your diet dialed in really well, those other factors affect you less. You know what I mean? You could still be really stressed out and still not be sleeping enough, but you may not be affected as negatively as you would if your diet was still a little bit out of whack. But, to talk about the real nuts and bolts more than just sort of stress, which is almost like pie in the sky. Is that really true? Some people are really stressed out and they're thin. So there are a lot of different medications that can interfere with weight loss. Some things that people don't even realize. I mean, of course, insulin, some of the diabetes medications, a lot of steroid medications that people take for pain or for allergies. I just learned recently that Flonase, which is a nasal spray, can interfere with fat loss because it's a steroid that the body will absorb through the nasal passages. So I think there's those lesser known things and I'm becoming of the opinion now that drugs, pharmaceutical drugs have so many weird, unintended, unknown effects that it's almost like any drug can possibly hinder fat loss for any number of reasons. And then, of course, I think you and I were going to talk about thyroid. I mean, if you have suboptimal thyroid function, you will struggle mightily to lose weight no matter what you do, even if your diet's on point, even if you're exercising. You can't, Asim Malhotra and Tim Noakes and I think Steve Finney, they wrote an article a while back called "You Can't Outrun a Bad Diet." You can't out keto an underactive thyroid. Mm-hmm. You can't out exercise an underactive thyroid.
And what would you say to people who've been to their doctor and said they think they might have a problem with their thyroid? The doctor sends them off for a TSH test, which comes back within norms, so they're told to go away. But, what are some of the things that are absolutely typical of being hypothyroid that they should go with the list and say, hold on a minute, I've got these symptoms? What are the kind of things they should be looking out for that might indicate that this is a problem they have?
Right. So first, I'll talk about the symptoms in a second, but first, that TSH test is not useless, but it's extremely incomplete. If you suspect you have a thyroid problem, you must insist on getting a comprehensive thyroid panel. And if your endocrinologist doesn't know what that is, find a new one because they should. The TSH test, it's almost like getting your blood sugar tested. Oh, my blood sugar is normal. That tells you very, very little about what else is going on metabolically, right? So just the TSH is it's a very, very limited, small way to look at total thyroid function. There's many, many other tests, just like with blood glucose, your TSH could be perfectly normal, but your other thyroid-related hormones are completely out of whack. And that's very, very common. So I really love for people to go by their symptoms. Now, it's important to have the lab work just to confirm that something actually is measurably off. But if your body is screaming at you with thyroid symptoms, then you have a thyroid problem. And you don't have to have all of these problems to have a thyroid issue. You may only have a couple. You may have, all of them or some. So the biggest ones are weight gain or inability to lose weight with no change in your diet, or when you have improved your diet and exercise and you're still gaining weight. Depression, constipation, hair loss, being cold all the time, low blood pressure, low heart rate, edema, fluid retention, especially in the lower legs. In very severe hypothyroidism, you'll have brain fog, problems with cognition. There's probably a few that I'm forgetting. A hoarse voice. I mean, it really runs the gamut, but a lot of them can be explained by the fact that the thyroid is the master regulator of your metabolic rate. Mm-hmm. So that's why you get cold all the time. You're not even producing enough energy to heat yourself internally. It's why you gain weight. It's why you can't lose weight. It's why the slow heart rate. It's even why the constipation. Every process in the body slows down, even the movement of waste through your colon. And if I sound passionate or I'm sounding loud about this, it's because I am on thyroid medication myself.
Me too.
I've been hypothyroid. Yeah, I've been hypothyroid for a few years. It's not Hashimoto's. I have another type of hypothyroidism, but I went through 2 or 3 years of severe symptoms. I had crippling depression, terrible constipation, the hair loss. I mean, I had it all. And I tried to fix it myself. I tried a lot of different sort of natural remedies until my life became unmanageable and I got on the meds. And I wish that I had gotten on the meds sooner because I could have spared myself a long time of those symptoms. But I will say there are a number of people who have hypothyroidism who start a ketogenic diet and they get better. Mm-hmm. They're able to stop their medication or reduce the medication. So it seems to be a highly individual thing. I mean, my hypothyroidism started after I was already eating low carb for a number of years. So I don't think doing low carb or keto wouldn't have fixed it because I was already doing that. Mine happened for some other unidentified reason. But I think if someone out there is dealing with a hypothyroid condition, it couldn't hurt to try low carb because there are plenty of people who've improved it that way.
Yes, I mean, I think particularly with Hashimoto's, you can see improvement. I mean, I still have to take my medication, but I did recently retest my antibodies and they have significantly improved. And that I put down to eating low carb keto. But yeah. I think the other problem that people come across is that even if they get the diagnosis that they're hypothyroid and receive treatment, that treatment is often T4 only. And that was certainly me. I mean, I was diagnosed back in my 20s, and it was only fairly recently that it was re-diagnosed as Hashimoto specifically. And it was only after I'd done some research on the Stop the Thyroid Madness website and saw how
I love that website. Highly recommended to anyone listening. Highly recommended.
I read the website and the book, got the book, and went to my GP and asked him to do some more tests. Specifically, it was free T3 and free T4 that were really important. and to get those figures. And it was then that he put me on. I'm still on all synthetic. You can't get the natural desiccated here in France. But now I'm on a T4, T3 combo, and much, much better. And I was on T4 only for years and still had symptoms. And, I hear that so often.
Yes, I hear it often too from clients that are, they come to me, they say, I'm on thyroid medication. Well, if you still feel like garbage, if you are still wildly symptomatic with thyroid symptoms, then you're not on the right medication. You either need a higher dose or you need to be on T3 as well. I'm on both T3 and T4. I stopped my T3 for a little while just to see what would happen. And I forget, it was a couple of weeks. And then I tested, and my free T3, or my total and free T3, were very low, which told me that my body was not converting the T4. So I do need to be on both. At least I hope at some point to be able to get off the meds. I don't want to take this medication, but it has, without exaggeration, saved my life. It's changed my life. It's saved my life. So I'm as much as we tend to badmouth pharmaceutical medication in the low-carbon keto world, and we tend to think, oh, you should be able to fix everything with keto, I am so grateful that this medication exists and that I was able to get my hands on it. But yeah, if your doctor is uncooperative, find a new doctor. You are well within your rights to stand up for yourself and be your own advocate. Your doctor works for you. He or she is your employee. You're paying them to provide you a service. And if you're not happy with the service they're providing, find a new one. That's all I can say. If you are still symptomatic, then I'm not going to say I don't care what the blood work shows, but I'm so much less concerned with the number on the lab printout than I am with how somebody tells me they feel. That's the most important thing to me.
Exactly. They should look at both. And that's exactly actually what my GP does. When I have the annual testing saying and go in, and the last time my free T3 was up over the top end of the scale. But instead of just telling me to reduce the medication, he said, well, how do you feel? Are you having hyper symptoms?
Mm-hmm.
No, I said, I'm fine. So he said, well, so great. So that tells me, in combination, that the blood test results told me I needed to ask you the question, but you've answered my question. Your symptoms are fine, so we don't need to adjust the medication. They really need to take into account symptoms every single time.
Yeah, they do. And I was very lucky that I worked with a naturopathic doctor who I knew was very knowledgeable on this type of stuff. And she instructed me in how to modulate my own dose. If you only get one dose and it's one pill, then you really are unable to change the dose as needed, because at one point I was over medicated and I needed to cut it back a little bit. And even now, every couple of months, I do have to change it up a little bit. I notice whether maybe I'm a little bit too low or a little bit too high. So I think it's like that fable Goldilocks and the Three Bears with the porridge. It's too hot, it's too cold, or it's just right. So people have to figure out if it's too high, it's too low, or is it just right? And your body will tell you. I mean, I feel like a completely different person now that I'm on this medication. I just can't, I could cry thinking about it. It was life-saving, life-changing. And I think hypothyroidism is wildly underdiagnosed. I think it's under-recognized. And I don't know why hypothyroidism is so common. There's a lot of theories about why, but all I know is that it is very common, and more common than most people think.
And so important to fix and get those levels right. And I was reading a post the other day on the forum where someone had a diagnosis that they were hypothyroid, and they were throwing all these things into the mix that they thought they should try and fix to help fix the problem. And it was making this change to diet, making that change to exercise, this, that, and the other. And no, you need to, not saying those things might not help at some point, but you really need to focus in on fixing your thyroid first.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to me. And I wrote a blog post about this a long, long time ago, about the impact of hormones on the metabolic rate, right? Why is it that some people have what we call a fast metabolism versus a slow metabolism? I mean, we all know people who don't eat that much and who exercise and they're heavy. No, even if they're not low carb, but even if they are, they don't eat much, they exercise, they're heavy. And we all know people that eat junk and have sedentary jobs, they never exercise, and they're thin. And I think some of it is just the way their hormones are. And I think if your hormones are not right, like I said, you cannot out-exercise, you cannot out-keto a dramatic hormonal imbalance that is keeping your metabolic rate really sluggish. And I mean, I see this in my own life. I work out a lot. I eat low carb and I'm still significantly chubbier, squishier, whatever you want to call it. I don't look like somebody who works out as much as I do.
I don't know. I've seen a picture of you in a stunning red dress on the low carb cruise.
But I'm soft. I've lost weight, but I'm soft. Like, I'm not very muscular. I'm not very, quote unquote toned, even though that's an awful word.
Not
too.
what you think you should be for what you do.
Yeah, that quote unquote should, which is problematic in itself, exactly. That should word. But I do think I also am overdoing the fat. I think that I need to cut back on my dietary fat. We'll see if that does anything. But I also, you can sort of, it's hard to explain, but I feel like you kind of know when your metabolism is not quite like somebody else's, because you see what they eat and what they do, and they shouldn't look as good as they do for how they eat and live. And all I can think is, like, internally, their hormones, whatever, neurotransmitters, their metabolism is firing on all cylinders, and some of ours isn't.
And also, you just don't have the energy that some people speak about. And so that's telling you the same thing, isn't it? That your metabolism just isn't firing on as many cylinders as somebody else. You're thinking, well, why do I feel tired when I shouldn't feel tired? It's not just about your shape and size, is it?
Right.
You mentioned earlier about blood glucose, and we were talking about the testing with the TSH test and relating that back to just testing blood sugar and how unreliable that is as a health marker on its own. And I know you're a staunch advocate in the importance of finding out what's going on with insulin, because it's so key. Tell us a bit more about that and what kind of testing would be beneficial.
Right. So there are a number of chronic health conditions and metabolic conditions that are driven primarily by chronically high insulin. And this is missed because testing insulin is not a routine part of standard blood work the way a fasting glucose is, or even A1C is starting to become more routine. And there's so many people who have perfectly normal blood sugar and perfectly normal A1C because very high insulin is keeping those things in check. And so these people may be dealing with some kind of health problem that nobody realizes is being caused by insulin because nobody's measuring insulin. It's a more expensive test. It's a more complicated test. But, I wrote a book on Alzheimer's disease, which they now call type 3 diabetes. And one of the most, powerful risk factors for Alzheimer's disease is chronically high insulin, even when blood sugar is normal. Same thing with PCOS, same thing with gout, erectile dysfunction, high blood pressure, abdominal obesity. These people are basically diabetic. They're just not diagnosed because their blood sugar is normal, but the blood sugar is normal because of high insulin. The only reason they're not officially diabetic is because diabetes is diagnosed solely by measuring glucose. They never factor in insulin. And so I think a fasting insulin is probably the most important test that a lot of doctors are not doing. And even, I have to say, even some of the low-carb doctors have actually mentioned that they don't think fasting insulin is that important because they think it's highly variable. They don't think it's super, super reliable. I see their point, but I still think it's really important to test because if it's high, if your fasting insulin is high, automatically there's a problem. If you're waking up, and you haven't, even if you ate right before bed, you haven't eaten in 6 or 8 hours and you wake up and your fasting insulin is high, something's wrong. The problem with the fasting insulin is that in some people, it will be kind of like fasting glucose. Your fasting level will be normal, but once you eat a meal, your insulin rises very, very high and it doesn't come down to baseline. Like the whole day it stays elevated. It'll come down a little bit, but it won't ever come down to, quote unquote, normal. And the fasting insulin test doesn't tell you that.
No, and people can, and the reservations they have is because it's pulsatile in nature, isn't it? So you can't necessarily get an accurate reading from one pinpoint measurement, but you can pin it down a little bit more, can't you, if you combine it with a fasting glucose at the same time and plug it into the HOMA calculation. That gives you a reasonable indication.
Yeah, we talked about that before we started recording. There's a measurement called HOMA-IR, HOMA. It stands for Homeostatic Model Assessment of Insulin Resistance. Homeostatic meaning how hard is your body working to keep you at homeostasis? How hard is your body working to keep your blood sugar normal? This is really important for low carbers and keto dieters because some people find that after they've been on low carb or keto for a while, their fasting glucose is actually rising a little bit. And it won't rise to like diabetic levels, but it may be over 100, 105, 110 for a fasting level, which a lot of people would be alarmed about. Oh, why is it so high? You tend to think you want to see it in the 70s or the 80s. And a lot of the low carb and keto MDs I know are not really concerned at all with a fasting glucose that's slightly above 100, because especially if insulin is low, that's what the HOMA-IR tells you, how much it's a combination of your insulin and your glucose fasting. And the lower, the better, basically. So this is why if you, for example, have a fasting glucose of 105, 110, but your insulin is 2, that may be a better indicator of metabolic health than someone with a fasting glucose of 84 whose insulin is 12 or 15. Generally speaking, you want the lower insulin, but I'm saying that now. I reserve the right to be wrong, because if anyone listening is familiar with Dave Feldman's work with his cholesterol experiments, he's blowing up everything we ever thought we knew, not just about cholesterol, but about all kinds of measurements and how malleable and how changeable are these things that I think it's almost like with the thyroid testing, all of these numbers, glucose, insulin, triglycerides, blah, 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 they're indicators, they're markers, but they're very changeable. And I think our obsession with the math and with the data is working against us in a lot of ways, because maybe we don't know everything there is to know, even about the HOMA-IR, even about fasting insulin. Maybe this isn't quite what we think it is right here in June 2018. So I do reserve the right to be wrong, but those are my feelings for now.
And so that will give you some indication in black and white of where you're at. But as you were saying just now, that doesn't tell you what's going to happen during the rest of the day. It only tells you anyway what your fasting insulin is. Right. And without going out and getting a specific test for that, what are some indicators? So we're talking about the importance of looking at symptoms. Well, what are the indications that people can identify in their own life that would imply that they have a problem with higher insulin for the rest of the day than is the norm?
I do think probably the waist circumference seems to be a biggie. The bigger your waist, the higher your insulin probably. Skin tags are a symptom for many people of chronically high insulin. Women with infertility, especially if they're overtly overweight or even maybe just a little bit kind of on the chubby side, if there's really no other explanation for infertility or, irregular periods, they might be on either have PCOS or kind of be on the borderline of it. Because the chronically elevated insulin does affect the other hormones, some of the reproductive hormones. Other than that, it's hard to say, because a lot of the symptoms with like low energy or other sort of mental and emotional symptoms, I don't know for sure whether those are more closely tied to insulin levels or blood glucose levels. It's hard to say. I think the indicators of insulin are more like those visible things. And then I do think the blood work, like a high triglycerides and low HDL, is generally a sort of indirect indicator of high insulin.
Yes, I mean they're both that way. You want, if your HDL is getting too low, and triglycerids are basically, aren't they, showing you how much fat is in your blood, which is not a good thing if it's high.
Yeah. I think even this is I'm speculating here, but I think abnormal tissue growth is usually an effect of insulin. Insulin is a growth stimulating hormone. It's not it's so much more than a blood sugar hormone. I'm going to be writing a post about this in the next few weeks. Regulating blood sugar is almost one of the least impressive and powerful things insulin does. So, whether cancer is kind of iffy, so I hesitate to talk about that, but benign prostate hypertrophy, the enlargement of the prostate gland, or fibrocystic breast, even PCOS, polycystic ovaries, it's all insulin. I mean, the funny thing is PCOS, you can actually get a PCOS diagnosis without ovarian cysts. You do not require ovarian cysts to have a PCOS diagnosis, but certainly insulin really does promote aberrant tissue growth. So I think that's why the skin tags, it's why the growth of fat cells, but also I think cysts in the body.
Interesting. And we were chatting a bit earlier before we started recording about personal fat threshold, and that tied in with insulin resistance, and how adding subcutaneous fat is potentially just a protective mechanism. I was just wondering, it just made me think of what you were talking about then, about the difference between benign growth and dangerous growth, that the more benign subcutaneous fat versus the harmful visceral fat, and wondered if that gets tied in with these other extra growth that is damaging to the body.
I mean, it could. I'm so fascinated by the personal fat threshold theory, and if people aren't familiar with that, I want to say it was Rod Taylor. I forget his name. I think he's out of Australia or the UK. And there's a guy named Keith Frayn, Frayn, who's written a lot of good papers on this too. I mean, any theory, any idea that accounts for obesity and or type 2 diabetes or metabolic syndrome has to explain why all of these conditions happen in people who are obese and normal body weight. So obesity, to me, is a symptom of a metabolic dysregulation. It's a symptom of high insulin. It's not the cause. Because plenty of people who are thin have ragingly high insulin. So, or if obesity is a cause, it's clearly not the only cause, because people at a quote unquote normal weight can also have hypertension and gout and cysts and aberrant growth and BPH and all this other stuff. So the personal fat threshold basically says we each have our adipose tissue, the actual fat tissue in our body where fat is supposed to be stored, has a limit. It has a capacity. Once that capacity is full, if you're still overeating or hyperinsulinemic, or your body is storing fat for some reason, once your personal fat adipose threshold is reached, your body has to start putting fat someplace else. And where else it puts it is going to be in your muscle tissue. That's like marbling. Like we prize beef that's marbled because it's fatty and it's flavorful. Well, we get marbled people too. Fat will also be deposited in and around your liver, in and around your pancreas. And it seems to be, Dr. Fung has explained this really, really well in his new book, the Diabetes Code, where basically the fat that we all love to hate, the fat on our hips and our bellies and our, these upper arms, all of that is, for lack of a better word, safer, metabolically safer. it's safer to have that fat because that's where the fat's supposed to be. It's supposed to be stored in the periphery. When the fat starts accumulating in your organs, specifically the organs that regulate blood sugar, like your pancreas and liver, that's when you get into trouble. That's when you start having problems, either, I guess, secreting too much insulin or not secreting enough, and the blood sugar starts to rise, the fatty liver. And I think this is why some people will develop type 2 diabetes or metabolic syndrome, even in the absence of what we would consider overweight or obesity, because maybe their personal fat threshold is very low. So their adipose tissue, their hips, thighs, bellies, waist, don't become very large like mine would, but their liver is engorged with fat. Their pancreas is engorged with fat. So they have all the other metabolic problems caused by that, even in the absence of looking like an overweight person. And you can see this internationally because China and India right now have exploding rates of type 2 diabetes at much, much lower BMIs, much, much lower body weights than in North America. Mm-hmm. And it's because genetically, constitutionally, they just don't have the same personal fat capacity that we European and North Americans have. They tend not to become obese, but they have the diabetes, they have the blindness, they have the Alzheimer's, they have all the other stuff. And I think this has always been a personal issue for me because I've never been obese. I've always, at my heaviest, I was just a little chubby. I was a little overweight, but I think I'm so saddened and just horrified by the fat shaming and the fat weight stigma in modern society, because we tend, the people that don't know better, the people that don't know how this works, look at a heavy person and say, you are a lazy, greedy slug. You never exercise. You must just sit around all day and do nothing but eat. And that couldn't be further from the truth for so many people that are heavier. We're more active. We eat better than people that are thinner. And I think a lot of these metabolic problems are pinned on obesity or overweight because we can see it. Well, no wonder you're diabetic, you're fat, exactly. Or you're obese. Mm. Okay, but now explain to me why someone who's perfectly thin has diabetes or has cardiovascular disease or hypertension. So we have this knee-jerk stigma and judging of people based on their size. And we do it even in the keto community. We do it. And I really wish we wouldn't. Maybe we do it less, or maybe it's done behind closed doors. But I know, for a long time when I was still a little bit heavier, I did not attend a lot of the low carb and keto and paleo events because I felt like I didn't look the part. I felt like people would look at me like, oh, she's so much fatter than I thought she'd be. And I know other people who do that. They stay home from some of these really fun events because they think they're going to be judged or shamed.
Which is crazy, apart from the fact that, who goes from A to B overnight anyway? We're all at a part of the process. It'd be great. So, what are we supposed to do? Hide ourselves away until we're at the perfect end result, and then we can display ourselves to the public. It doesn't work that way.
Someone could start at 350 pounds and they lose 100 pounds. Well, guess what? They still weigh 250. So someone could look at them and say, wow, you're so big, not knowing that they've already lost 100 pounds and they look fantastic.
It's an incredible result. Of course.
Yeah, but it's why I know that the two keto dudes produce this show, and I'm not trying to flatter them or anything, but I really appreciate what they do and how they put on Keto Fest, and I'll be there this year, that it's so positive and so welcoming to all shapes and sizes because everyone is on the journey. And I think that people still being big or people losing a lot of weight and then gaining some back just helps all of us remember how hard this is sometimes. For some people, it's magic. They go keto, they lose weight, they never gain it back, and life is grand. And for some of us, we struggle. And I think it helps to see other people that it's not magical for everybody, and it is difficult sometimes.
And it is this whole thing that's been drummed in by the media and other people of just this obesity is the problem for all of the world's ills. And there's always, a picture of some poor person that doesn't realize that they've had a picture taken of them because they happen to be obese, that they're, that the picture goes with the headline and over. And like you said, I can remember being that person, and you're just carrying it around with you, and it's not something you can hide. It's not something like if you're a slim type 2 diabetic, you can hide your type 2 diabetes. It's not obvious just by looking at you. Whereas someone who's obese, it's all right there. And actually, I have no idea what my personal fat threshold is, because I got to 134 kilos. I don't know what that, I think it's probably about 300 pounds. I still had, although they were starting to creep up to a beginning of a worrying level, I still had good blood glucose control. I still had good HDL. I still had low triglycerides. So presumably I hadn't got close to my personal fat threshold yet. But that was me, a big obese person who was actually metabolically quite healthy. And I think Ivor Cummins has that chart, doesn't he, with the 4 different types.
Yeah, they actually call this the metabolically healthy obese. And it's exactly that. When your body is putting fat where it's supposed to put it, you're actually insulin sensitive, right? If you weren't insulin sensitive, your body wouldn't be storing that fat, I think. And there's the opposite of that is what they call normal weight obesity. And it's that skinny fat that we all know about, TOFI, thin outside, fat inside. Normal weight obese, meaning they are at a quote unquote normal weight, whatever that even means, but they have the metabolic profile. They have the inside blood work of someone who is, I can't even say someone who's obese, because it's not the blood work of someone who's obese. No. It's the blood work of someone who's metabolically deranged. And you can have metabolic derangement at any body weight. So
exactly. It's not a great indicator. What's going on the outside isn't a great indicator. Yeah. And so that's tied together then as well, isn't it? The personal fat threshold is tied with that tipping point of when you go from being insulin sensitive to insulin resistance.
I think so, because I just like I said, I just and this, I think I'm sort of paraphrasing from one of Keith Frain's papers. Any theory that attempts to explain any of this has to account for all of these diseases of civilization happening in people of every body weight. Lean people, heavy people, fat people, thin people, tall people, short people. And the personal fat threshold seems to explain a lot of that.
Mm-hmm. And the logic works for me as well, that it's supremely easy to put on weight when you're insulin sensitive, specifically if you eat carbs. And I know that for me, I can put on weight extremely rapidly if I start eating a lot of carbs. It goes up phenomenally fast. So it's interesting. But yeah, I too have an issue with this body size stigma and fat shaming that goes on. It's just, it's too easy. That's what I always felt. I always felt about criticisms that gets thrown, people calling you fatty and people saying you're fat, you must be lazy, and it's too easy. It's too easy a slur. I'm wearing it. I can't hide it. Come up with something a bit more original.
Yeah, but I think something to be said is that I don't even know if what is a healthy body weight? What is a normal body weight? Are we all meant to be a size 4? Is every woman supposed to have a 20, 25 inch waist? I don't even know what's normal. Like that's really skinny. But somebody once said, and I don't remember who it is, so I can't give them credit, but I didn't come up with this. Somebody said that a low carb or ketogenic diet will get you as lean as you can be, but that may not be as lean as you want to be. So you may get down to a certain body weight that you're healthy and you're happy and you look okay. You may want to lose another 10 or 12 pounds. And if you're going to do that, it's going to take heroic, extraordinary measures because your body doesn't want to go there. Maybe your body is really happy and you're healthy at a size 10. And I don't know what that is in Europe. I mean, I know you're in France. maybe a man is perfectly healthy with a 36-inch waist, but maybe he wants to be a 34.
Exactly. It's so individual, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's the thing. Your body's healthy set point might not be the weight that you want to be.
It might not get you on the cover of magazines, but you're perfectly healthy and everyone thinks you look fabulous.
Exactly.
You don't need to lose those last 10 pounds.
And that's quite often the thing, isn't it? When you see posts about people struggling to, they just want to lose that last 10 pounds or whatever it is. And that might be the only reason why it's so difficult to lose that without, like you saying, heroic efforts or manipulating your body past where it wants to be, because it doesn't want to be that lean for you.
Yeah. Right.
It's annoying, but we all come in different shapes and sizes, don't we? And at some point we have to accept what our body wants. Yeah. Well, it's been lovely talking to you again. Lots of information packed in there. I'm sure it's going to be another super popular show. I wonder if you've got a top tip to round us off today.
Well, I guess considering what we were talking about earlier, if somebody's struggling with fat loss, I do tend to discourage people from tracking and weighing and measuring everything. But if you think you're doing a good low-carb or ketogenic diet and you're not losing weight and you have a significant amount of weight to lose, we're not talking about the last 5 or 8 pounds. If you're still significantly, overweight, do sit down and really re-examine what you're eating. Are you having some carb creep? Are you really doing a lot of liquid calories, heavy cream, MCT oil, and just re-examine that.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Amy. It's been wonderful.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Take care.
To get the resources and links from the show, please go to ketowomanpodcast.com. Are you my next extraordinary woman? Maybe you've got an idea for a show, a topic you want to hear about. Let me know how I can tickle your earbuds by dropping me a line at daisy@ketowomanpodcast.com. If you fancy joining me on this exciting adventure and want to help me create new episodes, please go to my Patreon page at patreon.com/ketowoman, or simply hit the support button on the Keto Woman podcast website. It's thanks to the two keto dudes that I'm hosting this podcast. So please consider heading to their Patreon page at patreon.2keto.com and help them bring you more podcasts like this one. Please help other people hear about and find this podcast by reviewing the show on iTunes and Facebook. Every star and review really does help. It doesn't go unnoticed by me, the people who regularly like, share and comment on my posts. Your support means the world to me. Thank you. This week's quote is from Michelle Obama. Let's be very clear. Strong men who are truly role models, don't need to put down women to make themselves feel powerful. People who are truly powerful bring others together. Bye-bye, Keto Lovelies.